Hello, and welcome back to The Thrills of Censorship, a podcast that examines the reasons for and results of censorship during the Cold War. Today, we're going to be looking at something very specific, but very interesting and reflective of specifically Germany, East Germany's idea and reasons for censorship. We are looking at East German theater. Now, East German theater attempts during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s to keep up with the existentialism revolution of theater that happens post-World War II across the rest of Europe with different absurdist and existentialist theater forms and styles and subjects, but are blocked with the unacknowledged censorship of the arts that limits subject matter and style in East Germany. There was an extreme censorship from the East German government that was unspoken but very present because of their need to compete with West Germany to promote ideology, their country itself, to stop people from leaving, to stop Germans from leaving for West Germany, and to rehabilitate their reputation, to stop being seen as a dictatorship. When reflecting realistic negative aspects of East German society, economy, and politics, many artists, and specifically theatrical creators, were censored because the things that they were writing about and expressing through shows were not a good look for East Germany. And while not necessarily being an extreme critique of the government, any critique of any part of it made it seem like people were unhappy in East Germany and things needed to change. And while this was very much true, and this kind of criticism from the society that the government works for is necessary in a government, East Germany was determined not to have this kind of criticism, especially from inside the house, so to speak. Artists and theatrical creators either had to fit in with what was deemed acceptable in terms of subject matter and style, what painted a good picture of life in East Germany if they were doing any kind of realistic commentary, or were pushed to reevaluate their art, and if they did not reevaluate, their choices were essentially ruined. Now, censorship actually was overt at the very end of World War II and the beginning of the reparations process and the occupation of Germany for denazification, because of the deep-rooted things and attitudes and different ideologies that came about because of Nazi propaganda and ideology. It was necessary to censor different people and works and media to get rid of any Nazi ideology or impact that was left. However, this lasted only till about the end of the 1940s in East Germany, when specifically the education ministry told theater managers to ignore production bans that quote-unquote belonged to a post-war state of emergency. And so effectively, East Germany quote-unquote banned censorship in its art, in its cultural aspects and theater. I say banned, quote-unquote, because while they outright banned it, they said, we don't have it, it's not happening, there is no censorship, artists are free to create what they want. There really was a kind of social censorship and more of a pressure, rather than outright saying that different theater productions could not be put on. They were warned against it, they were bullied into doing rewrites and things like that, and if different theater managers did decide to put on a show that the government didn't agree with, the government made sure that the public reaction and the government reaction was extreme criticism and extreme denouncement. Denuncification is not a word, unless apparently I want it to be today. In turn, ruining different careers. And so artists were forced to decide whether or not reflecting the truth and what they wanted to say, and criticism that is inherent in theater, any theater that is talking about social aspects, is a reflection of that culture and that society, and criticism is inherent and doesn't mean it is a negative thing. But so they were forced to decide whether staying true to their worldviews and what they wanted to do as artists was more important than having a method of work at all. East Germany was so concerned about looking good and showing that their society was livable, and not just livable but enjoyable, because of the massive fleeing of East Germans and Germans to West Germany pre the Berlin Wall, because right after the USSR occupied Germany, there was extreme industrial reparations, huge farms, huge expropriation of factories and giant farms were taking place as sort of revenge of the perceived way that Germany had treated the USSR during the war. And they used something which was inherent in now is a key pillar of the KPD in Germany called collective guilt, which meant that whether or not these Germans and these large landowners and factory owners actually committed any crime against the USSR, they were held responsible economically. And therefore, East German economy plummeted, and food supply and different supplies of necessities were extremely meager, and so people began fleeing to West Germany in order to make a better life, because everything they had was gone and they could not sustain themselves. And this in turn created a vicious cycle where the Eastern economy was also further plummeting because of the loss of circulation and all of the people that it used to have. Loss of 3 million people in about 10 years was not sustainable. And so they put up the second big piece of land reform in East German history, which was the Berlin Wall, to stop people from leaving. And this seemed this seemed like a dictator move by East Germany, stopping their people from leaving, stopping people from fleeing. And so after this, East Germany was determined to change this reputation, not to be seen as a dictatorship, and in order to compete with West Germany, even the pre-Berlin Wall, because West Germany at this time was thriving extremely because of the US and Britain and France and their influences, and it was thriving economically and socially, and there was a clear ideological and economic divide between the two states, that it was clear that East Germany was the way worse off. And so in order to fix this, censorship was unspoken but still very present. And to look at this, we're going to look at a case study of Heinrich Müller, who was an extremely notable playwright in East Germany during the second half of the 20th century. I hate how centuries are like backwards, like it's the 1900s, but it's the 20th century. Always messes me up. Anyway, censorship in theater specifically, and Müller will face this, had the controls of censorship with none of the securities. And like I talked about, all of these dramatists, directors, writers, publishers, and managers were held personally liable for anything that they did. And theater is an art form unlike literature or poetry or different other written art forms, plays, and because of their nature of, the inherent nature of being alive, art can't just be hidden away under a desk in order to thaw out when the political climate is not so icy. It has to, it is a product of its time inherently, and so it can't just be pushed off. And so production bans were extremely harmful to writers who had put a lot of their time and a lot of their thought into their direction or their plays, because it couldn't just be tucked away for later use. It was done if it was done. And so Müller, specifically Heinrich Müller, was in his early childhood watched his father, a member of the SPT, be dragged away by Nazis, was a survivor of a concentration camp, and eventually was a Marxist in East Germany. He joined the Social Democratic Party, which was a merger of the KPD and the SPD, and was eventually expelled and joined the German Writers Association. He wrote one of his most famous plays called The Resettled Woman, which contemplated the consequences of early 1940s and 50s East German land reform. He wrote this in 1961, and the rehearsal process took place during the Berlin Wall went up, so there was that added layer of land reform. It follows the story of Niet, who is forced to leave the eastern provinces of the Reich after the war is over, they became Poland, and is resettled in the Soviet occupation zone of Germany, and is barely tolerated by everybody around her. She eventually falls in love with an anarchist who promises her the world and gets her pregnant, and this anarchist, who is intent on changing East German society, leaves her for the American zone of West Germany, and she eventually decides to live in solitude with other women who are treated poorly. It is a feminist critique, but it also chronologues. Is that a word? Chronologues, sure. The general struggle of caused by land reform in 1945. Mueller considered this to be a genuinely constructive aid to the building of socialism, something that he actually truly believed in. He was a socialist. He wanted to make life in East Germany better through socialism. And so he was thought, by offering this critique on what East German land reform, which we'll get into the history of that in a second, he thought that this would be helpful and well received by the government, perceiving that they were all working together to fix the different negative aspects of the socialism practiced in East Germany. Land reform was a key part of the future collectivization in the early times of the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany. Collectivization was a key part of communism, which was the goal. And so there was this extreme robbing of industry of East Germany by the Soviets as reparations for war, like I mentioned. And they hoped that this expropriation would win the KPD loyal voter groups who would establish communists throughout the political spectrum. There was this huge expropriation of not only industry, like I mentioned, but large farms, and so many large landowners were, essentially their livelihood was destroyed. It represented the compensation of historical justice towards the German farmer population, and by taking away all of this land and all of this industry, the Soviets intended to evoke a notion of crisis and decline that could be only saved by a higher activity of communism. And so by taking away all of the economic power of rural East Germany, they also hoped to push communism as the only thing that could save it by collectivization. While collectivization and expropriation was not publicly supported at all, it was accompanied by Soviet troops, and so this military presence forced people to comply out of fear. This land reform actually sparked a social revolution that fundamentally restructured the traditional social structure of these rural areas, in which big landowners were at the top, and everything below that, there's a word I'm looking for, like a little pyramid of who had the biggest farms, who had the most land, and who didn't. And while this isn't necessarily a good structure for society, it was the one that was present in Germany forever. Not forever, but for a very long time. And to rapidly restructure this and take it away was detrimental, especially with the lack of mechanization in industry because of that reparation process. That meant the livestock industry as well had to return to previous hard manual labor that hadn't existed for decades. And so many farmers, further lost their livelihood because they didn't have any experience with the kind of hard labor that used to be present in Germany, because they had the mechanization, they had the machines to do it, and so once that got taken away, everything fell apart a little bit. And specifically the context to the resettled woman, Germans displaced from Poland and Czechoslovakia, this eastern areas of the Reich, like I mentioned, when they were resettled back into the Soviet occupation zone, the majority of rural land was already divided, and they were treated with extreme hostility from other resettled Germans who had arrived before them out of fear that their land and things would be taken from them that they had to fight for, and from the villagers, the German villagers who were native there because of prejudice, and so there was this extra added layer. And so it's just a general, resettled woman is a general critique of the effects of this land reform. And we're going to look at what happened to Mueller after he staged this. He was publicly shamed, he was publicly denounced, the public got very angry, and so did the government. And so he was effectively, nobody published any of his work for 10 years because of his association with a negative reputation. And I lost my little place. He meagerly survived with his wife, writing fluffy radio dramas under a pen name. All of his more substantial work was, like I mentioned, not published for 10 years until the political climate did thaw. And which is interesting is the socialist project, in quotes from Mueller, was redeemed in the final aspect of his plays because, like I mentioned, he was socialist, he wanted socialism, he was just critiquing certain aspects. It didn't matter because he mentioned anything that could be seen as critique. And so this extreme reaction meant that East Germany looked like it had fires inside of the house. Any critique, even from people that supported the regime, was squashed by this public outrage, which acted as censorship. And so East Germany was so concerned with this because this, let's specifically, for example, this critique on land reform looked like people were unhappy, and the acknowledgement that things that the government had chosen to do and things inherent in socialism, like I mentioned, the collective guilt and the collectivization were key to the KPD's ideas of society and government. It looked like socialism was doomed, and it just further pushed the narrative that was already present in much of Germany, much of East Germany, and the world, that communism, at least in the Western side, this perception that communism was doomed to fail and was an extremely negative ideology that would, that was just horrible. And so, this interesting unacknowledged censorship was their way, paradoxically, is that also a word? I don't know. Anyway, it was a paradox, because in order to not seem like a dictatorship, as communism often does seem like a dictatorship, like with Mao and Stalin, well, it is, but in order to not be seen like the German Democratic Republic was a dictatorship, they participated in dictatorial, that's another new word, activities like censorship, but just subtly and discreetly. And many theater people critiqued this censorship too, stating that overt censorship would be better than what they had. Oh my gosh, I keep running into the computer card, I'm sorry. Would be better because it would be better than the embarrassment and failure that fell on theaters and artists. And it's very interesting, the paradox that has to happen in order for East Germany to be seen and how they specifically focus on theater because of it's a reactionary art form. And so it's interesting, it's a different kind of censorship, and that is this week's episode. Amazing.